Good morning, all. Uh, a warm welcome to one and all on this special day. Today, this day being special because it's a World Yoga Day and it's Father's Day. So, happy Father's Day to all the fathers in the group. And it's a solar eclipse. So, there are many things that are happening today. And on Sunday morning, I'm really thankful to all of you who have gathered here for this wonderful webinar that we're going to have today. Uh, Today's topic is an oculoplasty update, and I would not waste further time and would like to call upon our President Pune Ophthalmic Society, Dr. Gitanjali Sharma, to address the delegates, please. Dr. Gitanjali, please.
Thank you, Mukesh. Good morning. I welcome you all for Pune Ophthalmological Society's today's meeting. It is PPE, that is POS, Postgraduate Education Session. Today we are having oculoplasty update, and we are very fortunate to have two young dynamic oculoplastic surgeons with us as faculty. I welcome Dr. Raghuraj Hegde from Bangalore and Dr. Adit Gupta from Pune. Both of them have been trained in oculoplasty in India as well as abroad. Dr. Raghuraj has done his training from Singapore. Dr. Adit is from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, and also from LVP. Dr. Adit needs one more line of introduction. He's son of our very dear friend and POS member, Dr. Prabodhini Gupta. So he has genes. So we are very eager to listen to you, and I welcome all the PG students who have joined for today's session. They are going to learn a lot about oculoplasty. So let's start the meeting now. Over to you, Dr. Rujita. Thank you.
Thank you, President Ma'am, Dr. Gitanjali. Good morning to your friends, colleagues, seniors, and yes, our PG students for whom this program has been arranged specifically. I'm Dr. Rujita Machwe, Joint Secretary POS, and I welcome you all on this Sunday morning. I'll be moderator for this session of PPE series. First of all, I would like to congratulate our POS President, Dr. Gitanjali Sharma, for her able and cheerful leadership and innovative ideas which she just keeps on pouring on us all the time. And 3 cheers to our young dynamic secretary, Dr. Mukesh Paryani, for handling all the responsibilities with such a ever-smiling face, as you all know. It's a pleasure that we are able to give you a variety of webinars during this COVID era. So today we are having two eminent oculoplastic surgeons, as Dr. Gitanjali Sharma has already told you, as faculty. Stick to the following rules. The first will be, please switch off your audios and videos so as to get a better signal, okay? Because there'll be videos during the presentation. And start putting your questions in the chat box only after the presentation is over. So there won't be a disturbance in between. Okay, so let's start with the sessions. Our first speaker is Dr. Raghuraj Hegde. So his affiliations, I'll read. He is a consultant ophthalmic plastic surgery and ophthalmic oncology, Manipal Hospital, adjunct faculty ophthalmic plastic surgery services, Department of Ophthalmology, Kempegowda, director for India for the Vision Mission, Singapore. His special interests are facial trauma, reconstruction, facial aesthetics, surgery, orbital inflammatory diseases, thyroid eye disease, and ophthalmic oncology. He's also actively involved in public health and philanthropies. Public health, especially in India and other countries in South and East Asia. So over to Dr. Raghuraj Hegde. Please start sharing your screen, sir.
I'll just add one line to it. He's a wonderful dear friend of mine, and he's a prolific writer, a wonderful blogger, and he is a voice of doctors on various platforms, and he has been really important role in writing the guidelines for oculoplastic surgeons during this COVID times. Over to you, Dr. Raghu.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello?
You can
Yes.
start sharing your screen, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello? Yeah.
Raghu, we
Hello,
can
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Raghu.
Yeah, sure. I'll be sharing my screen now. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, yes.
So I'll be speaking about, hello?
Yes.
I'll be speaking about MRI, how to read MRI and CT and MRI. And I'll also be, in the between, I'll be taking some clinical examples as well. So that because just showing CT scan or MRI will not be enough. We'll have to see it in context of the clinical case. So I will be giving some clinical examples as well. So why should an ophthalmologist learn to interpret imaging studies? Two reasons. One is that often what we do is most people will go and read the report that is there in the along with this thing instead of seeing the images itself. But that way it is a little disadvantageous to the ophthalmologist because for the radiologist the eye is just a small part of the whole body, and among his whole total load, ophthalmology and orbit imaging is very small percentage, and so they won't have so much expertise in just orbit to see the finer details. And ophthalmologists, because they know a lot of the intimate anatomical details and things like that, they will be able to better interpret, because and also because they've already seen the patient also, they can relate it according to the context of the patient. So what are the advantages of CT? So it is a cheaper alternative to MRI. It is also, the duration is quick and short acquisition time. So it's very beneficial in children who are always moving. And MRI takes a longer time, almost about half an hour for acquisition of the images, and they have to be still during the whole time. So it's very difficult to get an MRI in a child. So CT is ideal for bony pathologies like fractures, calcification, and tumor mass, etc. Its advantages again in like a ferromagnetic intraocular body, etc. So it also has no absolute contraindications. Very few contraindications are there, but there are also disadvantages like exposure of ionizing radiation. Imaging is also less sensitive than MRI with regard to the intracanalicular and intracranial optic nerve and cavernous sinus. Basically, just beyond the orbit, it is very difficult to assess any structures. The bony orbital wall can sometimes interfere with the interpretation of soft tissue orbital content, which I'll be showing a few scans to show the exact difference. So, and another thing, because of the ionizing radiation, it can't be repeated many times. So again, MRI is so there's no advantages. It doesn't have any ionizing radiation, but has excellent soft tissue resolution of the orbital content, ideal for the optic nerve, pituitary gland, and also it is also advantageous in any orbital mass. So you can identify also the age of the hematoma. Bone marrow lesions have better resolution in an MRI, and also when you need contrast, the MRI uses a safer contrast than what we use for CT scan. But the disadvantage again is costly, and again, as I said earlier, it is prolonged examination for children, for obese patients, for claustrophobic patients. It's a little difficult to acquire the images. Contraindicated for with the ferromagnetic intraocular foreign body, because it has that magnetic field which is used to image it, and it's not suitable for bony lesions and fractures. And again, fat saturation can cause a hindrance in the interpretation of the images. So how do you request a CT scan? So what do you have to consider when you're CT scan? So whenever we are reading to read a CT scan or to order a CT scan or MRI, we don't have to know the intimate details of how a CT scan works or an MRI works, or what are the other lot of technical jargon is there. It's the same like how we are driving a car. You don't have to know how the car works, how the machinations work. You just need to know how to change the gears, when to brake, visualize what is there in front of you. CT scan and MRI reading is also somewhat similar. So what are the things that you need to consider before ordering a CT scan? So slice thickness. So you can see on the image here that there's a tube that there's an X-ray tube that sends out images, and which when you send out images, there is a detector on the other side. So the tube and the detector move together in one full rotation and in a particular pre-decided slice thickness. So when it goes through one full circle, all the images are taken in by the computer, and then it is again reconstructed using the computer reconstructs it slice by slice. So slice thickness will give, the lesser the slice thickness, the more the resolution. So in a small area called orbit, in a small area of orbit, it is usually 1 millimeter thickness is considered as ideal. At least a minimum of 2 millimeters is required. Otherwise, we may miss important details regarding the pathology that is required. The imaging plane. So there are three imaging planes that we require in a CT scan or an MRI. One is the axial plane, the coronal plane, and the sagittal plane. The sagittal plane is not shown in this diagram, and there's also this Reed's line which goes from the inferior orbital rim to the external auditory meatus. So I will tell you the importance of it just little while later. So the Hounsfield unit is the unit of attenuation of the X-rays. So when the X-rays pass through the tissue, each tissue attenuates the part of the X-ray. So what happens is X-rays. So each tissue has a signature Hounsfield units by which the computer will be able to reconstruct it and show us the delineation between each of the units. So tissue windows and tissue width. So like Hounsfield units will have a range of units. So from plus 1000 to minus 1000. So we for each part of we'll have to take the range of the units between each of the parts. So to see a particular type of tissue. So there is something called a soft tissue window or a bone window, and even a brain window as well. So to demonstrate the difference, I'll show you this, where this is on the image on your left. Right is a bone window. So on the image on the left, you'll not able to see anything that is wrong, particularly in the left orbit. But here, when you see that there is a fracture in the left orbit, so this is only visible in the bone tissue window. So that is why you need the particular windows that you need to check. So whenever you're requesting a scan, it is important that, especially in the case of a fracture, where you need a bony delineation, you should request a bone tissue window during your CT scan request. So next, some tissues, some masses may require a contrast enhancement with this. So that decision is left with the radiologist. You can request them if you feel that you need a contrast enhancement, and they will decide on when they see the patient whether a contrast enhancement is required for the particular pathology. There are some modifications in protocol that may be required that you may have to specify in your. So especially if you want to do imaging of the visual pathway. So what you do is you request for the patient to be looking up towards his forehead, and the plane of imaging should be 30 degrees to this Reed's line. So that way the whole visual pathway is imaged by the CT scan. Sometimes sometimes you may have to include some brain cuts as well. So if the so again MRI, I'll again give you some rules of interpretation. So when you get an MRI, so you have to look for these things. So T1, there is something called T1 weighted images and T2 weighted images. You don't need to know. If you want, you can read up about what is T1 and T2. But for you to interpret it, you don't need to know why it is called T1. So T1 weighted images usually depict anatomical details. T2 weighted images usually used for pathologies. So how do you differentiate when you get a MRI? How do you differentiate whether it's a T1 weighted image or a T2 weighted image? T1 weighted image will be you just look at the vitreous. So in a vitreous, if it's hypointense vitreous and hypointense vitreous, you say that it's a T1 weighted. And if it's a hyper intense like this vitreous, it's a T2 weighted. So again, the brain also, so the rule of thumb is the brain will appear, the gray will look gray and white will look white. And in the brain, when you look at it, gray will be white and white will be gray. So it's a opposite. So this is a rule of thumb that you need to see when you get an MRI scan. So contrast studies, when the contrast is required, the best advantage of a MRI is that you can delineate tissues with the use of contrast. So T1 weighted images is always used with fat suppression. So fat becomes hyper intense when contrast is added. So we artificially through the computer we can suppress the fat. So it will look hypo intense. Like in this case, you can see that the fat within the orbit is suppressed. So contrast images can be recognized by the hypertense signals from the extraocular muscles. So you can see that extraocular muscles is lit up like this, and on the T1 images, and also the when you see the sinuses of the tissues as well, you can see that of the sinus mucosa is usually when it's not with contrast in T1 it will appear black, but when with contrast it will look like it is lit up. The thing. So fat suppressed images are recognized by the suppression of the hypertension factor, just mentioned just now. And it's a T2 flare. It is for specific pathologies like in thyroid eye disease. They'll be using these images. The gray and white matter of the brain will be like T2 images, and CSF will be dark. So these rules, I mean, as you go deeper into it, you will be able to. The more you read about it, you will get more and more information. So how we see them, I'll not go through each and every one of them. You can read about it from the. I'll give you the resource material at the end of this presentation. So basically, each in T1 weighted and T2 it appears a little different. So how do you go about diagnosing any pathology? So the best strategy is to divide it into compartments like intraconal, extraconal, subperiosteal, lacrimal, and globe. And there are other strategies as well, where is the location, sinus involvement, content shape. So I will go through all of these strategies simultaneously. Like I will be going through each and every type of case. So bone and sinuses, so sinusitis, bony tumors, and injuries due to orbital tumor comes under this diagnostic strategy. So in sinusitis, the mucosal thickening of the paranasal sinuses, opacification of the sinuses, as you can see, this has happened here. And the expansion of the sinuses can also happen with some bony remodeling. If it's there for a longer time, you will see some bony remodeling as well. And you can see that there is a, like here, if you can see, there is the infection that is there in the sinuses has spread into the orbit. So spread into orbit, and there is a elevation of the periosteum here. So this is called a subperiosteal abscess. It can grow to quite a big enlargement, causing even proptosis of the lesions. So sometimes, like how it becomes, when it becomes very big, the mucosa, the it becomes a mucosal and invades into the orbit, and there is a subperiosteal abscess that is formed like this. So it starts pushing the globe away and in front, causing a proptosis. So there are some bony lesions like this, where this is a fibrous dysplasia, which is slowly growing. It's a very slow growing bony tumor. It is benign in nature, but it can grow very, very slowly, and thus crushing the globe and orbit, and can cause a very lot of deformation in the patient's face. And so if we do the MRI of the same patient, you can see that there is some that multi-osteotic lesions you can make out in the MRI, which is not usually seen in a CT scan where it is more homogeneous in nature. So in this particular case, doing an MRI will not add any extra value to your diagnosis. You can diagnose it with the this thing itself. But in this case, the MRI was done to see if there is any brain issues, intracranial issues that is required to be taken care of at this remote. So what we did was basically a trim of the excess bone, and at the end of the this thing, you can see that we've taken a post-op CT. The below ones are the post-op CT, where we've trimmed off the bone from the this thing. So at around 2 months, you can see that you can appreciate that with the CT scan itself. At the end of 2 months, you can basically what is there on the outside. The CT scan is showing how much space has been created from inside to match the two sides. So orbital fractures, it is very pretty common in oculoplastic practice or in an ophthalmology OPD to get orbital fractures. Most of the orbital fractures that turn up in an eye OPD are a blowout fracture. So when you see when you feel that there is a fracture, when there is trauma, how do you request a CT scan? So this is very important that we don't over order or also under order. So when we do a CT scan, when you see that it's only the orbit that is involved, you just need to get the CT scan of the orbits. When you see that there might be other injuries in the face, you should also order a CT scan of the face. So basically, when you order a CT scan of face, the orbits are covered in the orbits are covered in the CT scan. So it is important that you don't just, when you see there is a extensive fracture and you only order the CT orbits, only the other fractures will be missed, and that is not desirable. So when you order a CT scan, you need to order 1 millimeter cut so that you don't miss the small fractures within the orbit, and it should be non-contrast. You don't need to add contrast to see a CT scan, and all the three sides. This is the coronal cut. This is the sagittal cut. There is no axial cut, but all three of the cuts should be available. And again, bone windows. So you see, this is a soft tissue window. This is to see that there is a fracture where it is prolapsing into the fracture site. You can see that the muscle is stuck within here. And when you get it to the bone window, you can see that you can visualize the fracture, how it is. It's like a trap door fracture with the prolapse of the orbital contents. So again, after that, after the bone windows, 3D reconstruction also is important, because it's just not, sometimes orbits are not the only ones which are fractured. Outside, it helps in visualizing what are the other fractures that are there outside the orbit. So just to give an example how this is a blowout fracture that came in with history of assault to the left eye. So when you see that there, you can see visibly that there is enophthalmos in the left eye by looking at the level of the lower and upper lid. So when you see, when you get an imaging done, you see that there is a medial wall fracture. Almost the whole of the medial wall is gone. When you see it in the axial, you can see that the whole of the medial wall is gone. And as well as when you see that there is some prolapse into the ethmoids of the ethmoids of the patient. So there is some, and because of that prolapse into the ethmoids, she has double vision when she looks on the side. And along with that, she also has enophthalmos, which you can appreciate in the clinical picture here, which is corroborated from the imaging as well. So after surgery, we put a titanium implant into the orbit, and to reconstruct the medial part of the orbit from the floor side. So once we see that it is after the patient has recovered from the surgery, we see that the enophthalmos is well corrected. We can see from here with the worm's eye view, as well as you can see that we get a post-op CT scan always after the fracture has been repaired. to see if the implant is in the correct position. You can see that the implant is in correct position and the muscles are within the implant. So this shows us, this gives us extra confidence that everything has gone well with the surgery. So this is another interesting case in which a child was he crashed into a tractor while going on a cycle, and at that time he lost his consciousness. But when they did a CT scan in the emergency room, nothing was detected, and there was CT scan was absolutely normal. And but slowly in 15 days time, he started developing this kind of a proptosis, an abaxial proptosis, which was and he had started having double vision. So when he presented to me about 15 days later, I saw the CT scan. There was nothing suspicious in the CT scan, but it didn't explain what was clinically I was seeing as a like a dystopia of the left eye, which the CT scan was not explaining. So I was a little suspicious about what it could be. It could be whether the intracranial contents are pushing in, or there is a subperiosteal abscess that is forming, or a hematoma that is formed above the eye. So I repeated the CT scan, and when we repeated the CT scan, we saw that there is a dome-shaped subperiosteal hematoma that is formed, and we can even see that there is a level of the blood collection that has happened. There is a level. So when we saw that, usually, like I said earlier in the presentation, I told you that each of the tissues has a specific signature. So each of the tissues within the orbit or around the orbit has a specific signature. So what we did in this case was we asked for the Hounsfield units of the collection that is formed in the orbit. So the radiologist called back saying that it was 63 Hounsfield units. So usually a hematoma is between 50 to 80 Hounsfield units. So this give us confidence that what is the collection is a hematoma and not something else. So this is a small video of how we put a large bore large bore needle with the syringe, and we aspirated the blood that is forming. You can see that the blood is getting collected. You can see that the blood is getting collected there. And the best part about this kind of a procedure is that you get on table resolution of that proptosis, and there is not much of not a lot of invasion, and not a very invasive surgery. So we removed about 20 ml of fluid in the orbit. So just for some context, volume of the whole orbit is around 30 ml, and in a child it will be even less. To remove 20 ml is quite a fair bit of volume of the blood that is pushing the eye out. So he was also having a RAPD because of the excessive traction that was caused by the proptosis. So this is about 1 week post surgery, post the aspiration of this thing, and with full resolution, and there was no more any RAPD or even diplopia. So orbital tumors. So basically, the first diagnostic strategy of how to diagnose an orbital tumor is where is the location. So first see where the location is, and then you can suspect what kind of a tumor it is. So medial orbital lesion usually will be a mucocele or a secondary from a secondary squamous cell carcinoma from an ethmoid sinus. Lacrimal sac fossa is if it's usually it is if it's benign. Most common benign lesion is a pleomorphic adenoma. But the most then it can be malignant. Malignant can be either a lymphoma or a adenoid cystic carcinoma. Adenoid cystic carcinoma is much rarer. So always keep those differentials at the very last. And inferior orbital lesion, again, very rarely you get a primary orbital lesion in the inferior part of the orbit, and most of the time it is a extension from the maxillary sinus. And because and most often it is because of either it's infection of the maxillary sinus or tumor that is arising from the maxillary sinus. And anterior ethmoidal, which is just outside the orbit, usually these are either a lymphoma, where the lymphoma is involving the fat of the eyelid, or a dermoid cyst, which will be attached to the bone, the choriostoma that is there, that will be attached with one of the sutures. So again, when you take a cross section of the, like a sagittal section of the orbit, you can see that depending on where so posterior orbit, which is the meningioma, the glioma, the orbit which is involving the optic nerve. So if it involves the optic nerve, usually it's a meningioma or a glioma. And if the intraconal space, the most common cause of an intraconal tumor in an adult is usually a cavernous hemangioma. And extraconal space in a child, the most common cause is rhabdomyosarcoma. And in adults or in children, it's usually a vascular tumor that is there in the extraconal space. But vascular tumors can occur in, other vascular tumors can occur in intraconal as well, or in any part of the orbit. So there's no strict, these are just representative. So let's go with the extraconal space. So again, this is the extraconal space where we can see that there is a mass in the extraconal space right above the globe. So here is a T2 weighted images. See, the pathology is there, and it is a contrast enhanced. So we can see that the contrast is enhanced, and it is homogeneous in nature. So it's a very diagnostic in a child. It's very diagnostic for rhabdomyosarcoma. Below 10 years of age, it's usually a very pathognomic feature. Anterior orbital lesion, like a dermoid cyst, like it comes as it's outside the orbit. So we can see that there is an orbit there, and here you can see that the Hounsfield units are very it's less than 0. You can see it's very black. That is indicative of the high content of fat within the dermoid cyst. So we remove the tumor, and but even though it is very uncommon, even posterior orbital dermoid also is known. So this is from so it is very rare to see this kind of dermoid. So we had to do a MRI to just confirm that it is actually a dermoid, and an MRI will give a better delineation of the mass. So you can see that it is well delineated in the T1 as well as T2 imaging. So intraconal mass like this, this is again very commonly seen tumor in adults in the intraconal space, which is usually the cavernous hemangioma. So just to give an example again, this is again a 30-year-old patient who came with prominence of the right eye. You can see that there is some proptosis in the right eye, and it's come. You can see in the worm's eye view that there is a proptosis on the right side. And when you do the imaging, you can see that there is a mass in the intraconal space, which is very well circumscribed. And when we remove the tumor, it comes as one full tumor in toto. Lymphoma again is lymphoma can present in the orbit as a primary lymphoma. So lymphoma, the feature that defines lymphoma is that it does not respect any orbital surgical spaces. So it can involve the extraconal as well as the intraconal space. So there is no usually this is what is very pathognomic of a lymphoma, where it involves multiple spaces within the orbit. So optic nerve sheath is optic nerve tumors are quite easy to recognize. Usually the most common optic nerve tumor is the optic nerve glioma, and meningioma also. Meningioma is usually involving the sheath that is involved that is continuous with the meninges of the brain. So when in an optic nerve sheath meningioma, usually there will be a there will be a thickening of the the surface of the optic nerve. This shows that it is a it shows that it's classically known as Tramtack appearance. But we have to also be careful that a DDA of an optic nerve sheath thickening can also be a metastasis that has got embedded within the optic nerve sheath. So that differential diagnosis should always be kept in mind. So retinoblastoma is we need to do an MRI for most of the retinoblastoma to see the mass as such. But again, I would also like to add that MRI is not a diagnostic tool for retinoblastoma. Retinoblastoma is usually diagnosed clinically from a examination under anesthesia. So metastasis can also present as mass in the globe. So here we can see that that there's a lacrimal gland. Lacrimal gland is invaded from the mass that is coming from outside. And here there is a within the globe there is a mass as well. So secondary orbital tumors is tumors which don't arise from the orbit space as such, and it arises from elsewhere. Like from here, the retinoblastoma is spread into the orbit, causing the orbital retinoblastoma. And here the squamous cell carcinoma of the maxillary sinus has spread into the orbit, causing a secondary orbital tumor of the orbit as well, which patient required a exenteration. So here again, a sebaceous cell carcinoma of the eyelid has invaded up to the mid-orbit. So once it has invaded into the mid-orbit, it is very difficult to get a margin negativity, and we may have to sacrifice the whole orbit. So we may need to do a exenteration instead of just a local resection and reconstruction. And in this case, the primary tumor is in the nasopharynx. So nasopharynx, from the nasopharynx, it has gone through the pterygopalatine ganglion, the pterygopalatine from the pterygopalatine fissure, and enter the orbit through that small little fissure, and it has become a large tumor within the orbit itself. So the primary tumor is a very small tumor, but the secondary tumor that has occurred in the orbit is quite a bigger tumor. So these are also things that we need to observe while when we order a MRI. So how do you choose which modality is important? So ultrasound can be done in the clinic, but it is a semi-quantitative approach to the tissue characterization. So CT scans is ideal for bony pathologies when you're suspecting bony pathologies, fractures, and you want to see calcification in tumor mass, paranasal sinuses, etc. MRI is good for soft tissue visualization, optic nerve, brain tissue, orbital apex, optic canal, cavernous sinus, etc., and even vascular lesions as well. So what is usually seen in imaging is that so in the ultrasound you can see that this is a choroidal carcinoma that is showing a thing, and here you can see that this is sphenoid wing meningioma, where we can see that it is coming from the sphenoid wing of the orbit. Here we can see the CT scan that is done, and it is not very well delineated what is the exact cause. Here when we do an MRI, we can make out that there is a mass that is invading into the orbit. From the ethmoids, it is an ethmoidal mass which is invading into the orbit, which is not very well differentiated within the with the CT scan. So
Dr.
usually,
Raghuram, can you sum up, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm almost done. So basically, malignant tumors are poorly circumscribed, and so again, muscle cone. This is a thyroid eye disease where you see that the muscles are involved. Where you can see that imaging in thyroid eye disease, the muscles are enlarged. You can make out, and thyroid eye disease in a CT scan, you can make out that there is a muscle. You can either order a CT scan or a MRI. CT scan will be better if you are planning a decompression, and also see if there is any optic nerve decompression. And usually what is to be looked out is for whether in a thyroid eye disease the tendon is spared or not. If the tendon is spared, it is diagnostic of thyroid eye disease. If the tendon is not spared, it is indicative of a orbital inflammatory disease. So thyroid eye disease, again just another example using an MRI, where you can see that the inferior rectus is hyperlucent compared to the other thing. So it shows that there is some activity that is going on in the inferior rectus. So, but when it's very uniformly involved, all the only a single muscle, you can see that there is a muscle that is you can see that there is it's a orbital inflammatory disease, and it is sometimes difficult to diagnose what is causing the orbital inflammatory disease. We need to do a full battery of tests before so non-specific orbital inflammatory disease is usually a diagnosis of exclusion when we cannot find the cause of what is causing the orbital inflammatory disease. Again, lacrimal component, as I already said, lymphoma, orbital inflammatory disease will be confirmed. Benign glioma, usually the pleomorphic adenoma. Malignant can be adenocystic carcinoma, which is quite rare. Preseptal, again, you can make out from the CT scan that this is the nidus of the infection and where it is going. Take-home points are to choose the appropriate imaging modality based on clinical examination findings rather than empirical testing. You should know what is the modality that you should use in particular regions, and to know what to look for in which scan. Ask for the appropriate scanning protocol for the pathology that you're suspecting. And sometimes classic radiological signs may be absent. Further discussion, always have a line with the radiologist to discuss what exactly discuss the case with the radiologist. The radiologist may be able to get you some better images where they will be able to tell you which are the other differences that you should be considering. And also history and clinical examination is very paramount in interpretation of the imaging. You cannot just you cannot just diagnose with the image, and you cannot treat a CT scan or an MRI. You should treat the patient. So you should always correlate between the patient and the and if you can take a screenshot of this slide or a photograph. These are the papers that I consulted while making this presentation, and this is very useful to read for any ophthalmologist to get an idea of how to interpret MRI and CT scan. And thank you for giving me the opportunity. I would like to thank the Pune Ophthalmic Society for giving me this good opportunity to talk to you on this Sunday. Thanks all for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Raghuraj, for a great, elaborate and very informative presentation with a lot of take-home messages. One thing I would like to highlight is that usually what we tend to do is that whenever such patients with CT and MRI come to us, we just directly jump to the interpretation by the radiologist. So my advice would be learn from these plates, start interpreting on your own. Because the thing is that the diagnostic yield is best when the ophthalmologist and the radiologist work together, as better clinical correlation is possible when the ophthalmologist is actively involved in interpretation of the CT and MRI. Thank you, Dr. Raghuraj. Audience, you can put your questions in the chat box. Thank you. Now introducing our next speaker, Dr. Adit Gupta from Pune. From Pune, Eye Plastic Surgery, HBT Medical College and RN Cooper Hospital, and he's attached to Dinanath Nageshwar Hospital also. And the most interesting thing which I found about his CV is that the last part of CV, that is happiest cooking, exploring cuisines that he gets time from the work. Very important. His main interest areas of interest is also involved in. Hello.
Hello, am I audible?
Hello. Hello.
Hello. Yes, Dr. Rajita, please go ahead.
Yes, yes. His main areas of interest are
I think Dr. Adit, you can start. There is some network.
Yeah. Am I audible and is my screen visible?
Yeah,
Yes. Dr. Adit, you can start. Your screen is visible, and welcome to POS this lecture.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Geetanjali Sharma, Madam, Dr. Mukesh, and Dr. Rujita for giving me this wonderful opportunity. While Raghuraj was giving his talk, I just saw that there is a good mix of audience in the participants. So I quickly reshuffled my slides and made it a little more different, because initially I had prepared it from the postgraduate point of view, but now I think I would give an overall gist of thyroid eye disease. I'm really passionate about this particular subject, and this was one of my major research projects when I was at UCLA. I label this talk as light at the end of the tunnel because these patients are really harrowed. There is no particular way to come to a correct treatment protocol for these unless you look at them carefully and follow them up for years, because these patients require years of treatment. I do not have any financial interest, but for postgraduates, we recently released this book, which is a very good handbook just to understand the updates in oculoplastics. It's published by Springer and is available online. You can also email me if you want any particular chapter. One point which I would like to drive through in this webinar is thyroid eye disease can have myriad presentations. As you can see, these three different case scenarios. Case 1 is a quiet disease but presents with diplopia. Case 2 is a severe proptotic eye and presents with some amount of congestion. And case 3 is an eye with obvious active disease where you can see chemosis of the conjunctiva and caruncular chemosis as well. Now, all these three cases presented to me and were referred to me, and all of them had had multiple courses of oral steroids. So what do you think? Do these cases actually need oral steroids? If you look at this person, he just has restrictive strabismus. It's an inactive disease. So for sure, he doesn't need oral steroids. The second case is of proptosis with congestive orbitopathy, no optic neuropathy, again doesn't need oral steroids or any form of steroids. The third case, which is the active case, is where steroids are actually warranted and indicated. So my first drive-through point to all postgraduates and all participants here would be, do not start oral steroids in all thyroid eye patients, even if they have proptosis or eyelid retraction or double vision. You need to grade the disease and then decide if there is any inflammation which warrants steroid therapy. Again, thyroid eye disease is not just about proptosis. It also has an aesthetic component, like this lady who in 2015 looked completely normal, slowly started developing enlargement or opening up of the left eye. As you can see, she has developed a lid retraction. She is euthyroid and has no other abnormality. And this is how she stays after years of observation. Again, this lady was started on oral steroids, which was not warranted in this case. This case basically warrants only aesthetic correction of her eyelid condition, that too if the patient desires, or you can let her live alone with this abnormality if she desires to. So through this lecture, I'm going to go over the course of thyroid eye disease, shortly about the clinical manifestations, management, surgical and medical, and how a multidisciplinary TED clinic can actually help these patients in need. Thyroid eye disease lecture cannot go without mentioning the Rundle's curve, which had been almost described in 1950s, where they classically say that the disease goes through two phases: the active phase, which lasts for around 1 year, 1 to 1.5 years, and then the stable phase, which shows the burnt out disease phenomena as seen here. It is the active phase which needs immunosuppression in the form of steroids or any immunomodulators, and that is where the medical therapy acts the most. Stable phase is basically a surgical phase where you actually want to do just surgery to correct the disabilities or to correct restrictive strabismus. We all know that thyroid eye disease has multifactorial etiologies, but it won't go without mentioning that cigarette smoking has the highest risk of progression in cases of thyroid eye disease, along with radioactive iodine in cases of thyroid dysfunction, which can flare up a disease, and obviously uncontrolled thyroid dysfunction. Not to mention that genetics, male sex and female sex has preponderance, but males have more severe disease, and orbital anatomical characteristics also play a role in the severity of the disease. But to mention something important would be the unique orbital fibroblasts. Now, orbital fibroblasts are very unique in the fact that they are multipotent and can differentiate into either myofibroblasts or adipose cells when stimulated by certain chemokines. They are also responsible for extracellular matrix hyaluronan accumulation within the orbit, which actually causes enlargement of the muscle and the fat compartment, thus leading to proptosis and mechanical changes which lead to the signs and symptoms seen in thyroid eye disease. So the major criminal is, if you ask me, in this disease is the orbital fibroblasts, and a lot of research has gone into typing and phenotyping these fibroblasts in the world. I already spoke about the Rundle's curve. It is divided into an active and a stable phase. If you look at any patient, a lot of clinicians get confused because you might see eyelid retraction and proptosis in patients, but they will have totally normal thyroid profile. So it is very important for us to know as practitioners that around 6% of thyroid eye disease patients are actually euthyroid. So there is a component called as euthyroid eye disease, which confuses everyone and delays treatment. Now, these euthyroid eye disease to a certain extent are associated with autoimmune antibodies, which can be found in the blood in certain patients. But mostly it's Graves' disease in 90% of the cases, primary hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism in a certain amount of cases. Also, if you see, of the total amount of thyroid patients who present with eye disease, only 5% are the ones who require treatment for moderate to severe eye disease that they have. Rest of them would usually not come to the clinic with any major complaints. Now, to focus on the diagnosis of TED, I won't overemphasize the fact that the diagnosis is 95 to 99% of the times clinical. You don't need any investigation to diagnose thyroid eye disease, except in certain borderline cases where they overlap with orbital inflammation. So, if your eyes are open, the patient actually and literally stares at you in a thyroid eye disease case. Thyroid panel in the form of T3, T4, TSH and thyroid receptor antibodies does help us in monitoring the progression of the disease. Now you can see from these myriad pictures that thyroid eye disease can present with unilateral asymmetric eyelid retraction. It can present with an active form where you have restrictive strabismus, simple proptosis, silent proptosis, bilateral proptosis with inflammation, and cosmetically disabling proptosis. So, if we go on to the signs and symptoms of thyroid eye disease, it involves the soft tissues, the eyelid, it involves the orbit, the extraocular muscles, and also the optic nerve. Eyelid retraction is the most sensitive as well as specific sign for diagnosis of thyroid eye disease case. So if you see a patient with unilateral or bilateral eyelid retraction, where you can see the lateral part of the eyelid flares up or is pulled up more, it is almost 99% certain that this is a thyroid eye disease case. You need to investigate them further. This can be unilateral or bilateral, and usually the lateral flare is also a good indicator of an early mild disease. Second sign which you can evaluate along with eyelid retraction is eyelid lag. So you ask the patient to look up and down, and if there is an eyelid lag on down gaze, as you can see, this eyelid is pulled up as compared to the other side. This is again a very sensitive test for thyroid eye disease. This happens because of the fibrosis of the levator muscle and sometimes engorgement in the active phase as well. Coming to the second sign, proptosis obviously is one of the main presenting feature for which patients come, or endocrinologists refer these patients to ophthalmologists. It can be asymmetric or bilateral. It can be because of either muscle enlargement or because of fat enlargement, which can be characterized by imaging, either CT scan or an MRI. This young lady presented with asymmetric proptosis with a Hertel's exophthalmometry difference of around 6 to 7 millimeters between both the eyes. You can see even the superior sulcus here is full on the right hand side as compared to the left, which is hollow. Sometimes this patient might be mistaken for ptosis on the left hand side. So this is a mimicker of ptosis or pseudoptosis, as I asked by examiners to postgraduate students. Third, the most important sign for activity is soft tissue involvement in the form of erythema and edema of the eyelids and the ocular tissues. So erythema happens in the eyelid. There will be congestion, a redness of the eyelid, swelling of the caruncle as seen here. There will be chemosis of the conjunctiva. You can see that there is bogginess of the conjunctiva. Congestion, the extraocular, the fat is enlarged here, the brow is thickened, and then obviously there is eyelid retraction as well. So these are all inflammatory congestive signs of active thyroid eye disease, which is again an indication for immunomodulation. Fourth sign which we see is burnt out disease. That is when everything gets over, these patients will come to you with just proptosis and disfigurement of the face because of fat enlargement, as you can see in this patient, where the brow fat as seen here is sausage shaped and is enlarged. This is the brow fat pad which you can see is enlarged, and the globe is pushed forward. So these are some of the signs of soft tissue changes in thyroid eye disease. Some patients might present to you with motility defects and diplopia. So inferior rectus muscle is one of the commonest muscles to be affected in cases of thyroid eye disease. As you can see here in the corresponding MRI, that the inferior rectus muscle is enlarged. This is the inferior rectus, which is taking up contrast as well, denoting inflammation. And rest of the muscles are also enlarged, but not as enlarged as the inferior rectus. You can see that the patient is unable to move the eyeball up. So this is because of a tight inferior rectus, which pulls the eyeball down. Now, this also causes increase in the intraocular pressure, which is also caused as the leash effect. So a falsely elevated IOP doesn't warrant anti-glaucoma treatment if there are no changes in the optic nerve head in these cases. It is because of a tight inferior rectus, which is very commonly seen. Patients who present only with restrictive strabismus do very well with strabismus surgery. Last but not the least, and the most sight-threatening complication is optic neuropathy, which happens because of compression of the optic nerve at the orbital apex. This is an urgent indication for decompression surgery. Now, before we go on to the management of this disease, keep in mind 3 pointers. The disease can be asymmetric. It can wax and wane because it is finally known to be an autoimmune disease. And there is a spectrum of disease. So some patients might present to you directly with end stage of the disease spectrum in the form of proptosis, and then some could present with bogginess, inflammation, and chemosis of the conjunctiva. Now, for postgraduates, there are certain scoring systems which help us in the clinic as well to grade and stage this disease. The most commonly being used are the clinical activity score given by Moritz. There are 10 pointers in the original system, which has been reduced later on in the modified clinical activity score. This is a very good system to be used to just determine whether the disease is active or not and guide treatment. I personally use this table. And then there's the visa classification, which is usually used by the Canadian and the European group. This actually gives a more subjective information about the status of the eye, inflammation, and everything. Plus, there is a modified visa inflammatory score as well. These classifications have only historic value, and you will find them mostly in textbooks mentioning, but you should know about them if asked by the examiner in your examination viva. Clinical tests mostly is all observation. You have to measure the palpebral fissure height, scleral show, and most important is doing an exophthalmometry. So you can use any exophthalmometer that your institute possesses, and this is basically good for serial examination and pre-op and post-op evaluation to determine the amount of proptosis that has reduced. Never forget to look beneath the eye. Also examine the thyroid gland. It might be staringly enlarged in such cases which has goiter, and you have to send them to a surgeon and an endocrinologist as well for any surgical intervention. Last but not the least, in investigations, Raghuraj has already spoken about this, is imaging of these patients. This is basically, so every thyroid eye disease patient doesn't need imaging. There are certain indications when you should image this patient. So one is if you are suspecting optic nerve compromise, you need to image them because you might have to plan surgery for them. Second is if you are planning to do a orbital decompression, you need to know the bony anatomy. Third is in patients with subluxation of the globe, which I'll be talking about later. And fourth is in patients where there is a confusion about the diagnosis or you're suspecting an orbital inflammation or pseudotumor as well. These are the only cases when you image the disease. You can see that this is basically a fat predominant disease, which I was talking about. This intraconal fat space is enlarged as compared to the muscles. The muscles are usually very strap-like. optic nerve is straightened. Usually the optic nerve is S-shaped in the orbit, and it is S-shaped to help it stretch whenever there is a disease. And on the contrary, you can see here that this is a muscle predominant disease where you can see the classical spindle shaped enlargement of the muscles. This is also called as the Coca-Cola bottle sign for postgraduates. The tendon is paired while the muscle belly is enlarged. So this is a muscle predominant disease. All the 4 muscles are enlarged, and this is the optic nerve in the center. Now, what treatment can you expect in the active phase? So I'll be dividing the treatment into 2 phases. One is active phase treatment and the chronic phase treatment. In the active phase, that is the presenting stage, it is very important to keep the thyroid function normal. This is one of the most primarily important things. You have to send the patient or work with an endocrinologist and get the thyroid profile normal, which helps in delaying the progression of the disease. There are things that the patients can do and the things that the doctors can do. It is very important to counsel these patients. It is very important to practice patience while counseling these patients, and also the patient has to be told that this disease is going to take a long time and you have to be with them through the disease. But things are changing. There are new drugs which are coming up, which I'll be talking about. But in general, while counseling the patient, you should tell them about avoiding smoking, active as well as passive. Have a good healthy diet full of antioxidants. It certainly does help in any autoimmune disease. And lubrication of the eye, it is very important. You need to give them tear substitutes to take care of the dryness which develops because of ocular exposure. Selenium has a role in certain cases. I usually give selenium to all my patients if they present to me with mild activity. The dose is 100 micrograms twice a day. There are varied reviews about this, whether to use selenium or not, but it doesn't harm. It's a micronutrient and can be given for a period of 3 to 6 months. Moisture chamber and glasses can help in patients who have very severe ocular surface dryness. Otherwise, usually tear substitutes and eye gels usually help very well for these cases. If the eyes are really dry and there is eyelid retraction, in the active phase, we can consider filler injections to these patients. Now, if you look at this patient, she has asymmetric disease. And because of that, she was also having certain cosmetic problems and also a little bit of dryness of the ocular surface. So these are OPD procedures which can be done. They are very easy to be done. The effect usually lasts for a year or so. And you can see that the filler injection is being injected into the levator aponeurosis plane with the help of a 29 gauge needle. You have to be careful about being away from the globe, and slowly you can do this procedure right in your OPD sitting as well. This is immediate filler injection result. The patient usually is very happy and the effect lasts for around a year or so. I have seen patients not requiring a second session of this filler injection as well. Now, in the active phase, some patients will come to you with diplopia as well, double vision. In the active phase, usually immunomodulation will cause correction of the double vision, which is because of the congestive component. Restrictive component diplopia needs surgery. So you can rehabilitate them either with prisms if the prism is manageable, and you can also tell them to tape their eye or try fusion exercises. Doesn't help a lot. Now, coming to what the doctors can do in the form of treatment in the active phase is steroids, radiation, immunomodulation, and surgery. Now, take a look at this gentleman who came with bilateral proptosis, but the active disease on the left-hand side. He has eyelid edema, congestion, chemosis, and pain on ocular movement. He also had strong diurnal variation. This was more during the day, which signifies a congestive component. What would you do in such a case? This is certainly an active disease and you need to reduce the signs of inflammation. And this is him after 6 cycles of intravenous steroid therapy. Usually we use methylprednisolone, and there are various protocols which I'll be talking about. Drug of choice for these patients would be IV methylprednisolone. I see a lot of general practitioners starting these patients on oral steroids. There are papers which talk about thyroid disease becoming more resistant or the recurrence rate being high when oral steroids are started as primary drugs in cases of activity. So IV pulse steroid should be the treatment of choice. The cumulative dose should not exceed 8 grams overall. because it can be hepatotoxic. I personally follow the Yugogo protocol, which gives around 500 milligrams pulse doses every week, 6 doses, followed by 250 milligrams for 6 weeks. This is a course of 12 injections over a period of 12 weeks. But what do we do when IV pulse steroids doesn't work, or there are major contraindications for the use of IV steroids? In such cases where the man is bedridden with a fractured neck femur, total glaucoma, almost no vision in both the eyes, but has developed severe proptosis with exposure keratopathy as seen here. He was bedridden and I was called for a home visit. He was living in Magarpatta city. I was called by a fellow ophthalmologist to take a look at him. In such cases, it is very easy to inject orbital steroids at home as well. I usually use Kenacort. I give it very similar to how we give a peribulbar injection in the inferolateral quadrant. And it has to be a very slow injection. Around 20 milligram dose is more than enough. This is him after 2 days of Kenacort. You can already see that the chemosis is resolving here. This is after 4 days. The proptosis is also reducing, 7 days. And after 10 days, the relatives were very happy and called me up thanking me because they could not take him to the hospital and IV steroids were contraindicated because of the fracture neck femur that he had. So orbital steroids do have a role in resistant cases and in cases where IV steroids are contraindicated. Radiation is very sparingly used in the Indian subcontinent, but a lot of Canadians and European authors do use it along with combination of IV steroids. I use radiation only in resistant cases where there is a lot of diplopia and extraocular muscles are involved. The dose of orbital radiation is 20 grays in fractionated doses over 10 days. So you have to distribute it over a period of 10 days. This gentleman, after steroids, still had chemosis, was having fluctuating disease between both the eyes, you can see. And then even after orbital radiation, which was considered as the last option some years ago, he still had active disease. So what to do in such cases? Now we have immunomodulators like rituximab, tocilizumab, methotrexate, azathioprine, which can be very easily given in conjunction with a rheumatologist. There have been various case reports and case series which have been reported by the use of these drugs, but none of them is FDA approved as yet for treatment with thyroid eye disease. The response is variable and the treatment cost goes high, but then we have no resort but to use these drugs. Now, fortunately, there is hope at the end of the tunnel. Recently, Ray Douglas, whom I worked with when I was at UCLA, was involved in this multicentral trial to develop a drug which is basically an IGF-1 receptor antagonist called teprotumab. This drug is showing wonderful results and is FDA approved now in the US for treatment of active thyroid eye disease. It has also shown to reduce proptosis to an extent of 2 millimeters. So this is one of the first drugs which has shown to reduce the proptosis as well. It is not available in India as yet. And in the US also, one injection or one session of this drug costs around $14,000. So right now it is very expensive. We hope that the Indian pharmacy companies very soon after the patent is wears off can replicate this drug so that we can use it in our patients as well. Last but not the least, patient support groups play a very big role in managing the active case of the disease. Now, when do we operate these cases? Usually surgery is done once the activity wears off. You wait for stability of the disease to happen at least for a period of 6 months and then start considering surgeries. Surgery in the active phase is indicated only in 2 conditions. One, when the optic nerve is being compressed and causing optic neuropathy, as in cases of tight orbits or severe proptosis, if there is a color vision loss or RAPD seen. These are indications for urgent surgery where we do a medial wall decompression. And second, these are cases where surgery becomes an emergency. Now, this lady presented to me complaining that when she bends down to lift a bucket, her eyeball pops out. This is a very classical case of subluxation of the globe, very commonly seen in thyroid eye disease and in severe myopia. What happens is when there is severe proptosis, the eyelid ligaments, the lateral canthal ligament, the medial canthal ligament, and the eyelid ligaments, they become lax, causing the eyeball to pop out. These are very painful episodes and very scary episodes and need immediate decompression surgeries or repositioning of the eyeball. Now, when we talk about surgery in thyroid eye disease, this is very important for postgraduates. There are 4 steps. You need to go step by step. Step 1 is always orbital surgery, where you do an orbital decompression. Second step is muscle surgery for strabismus. Third is eyelid surgery. And fourth is cosmetic rehabilitation if a patient desires. Not all patients need all the steps, so it is a very customized approach to management of a thyroid eye disease patients. I'll begin with talking about orbital decompression. Imagine a patient comes to you with this, which is stable since the last 2-3 years. She's a 30-year-old female wanting to look better because this is scary. Her children run away from her thinking that she's scaring them. Also, it is also causing a little bit of dry eye and irritation in the left eye because of the exposure keratopathy. Now, these cases can be very well managed by performing an orbital decompression surgery. In preparation for the surgery, you need a CT scan to look at the bone and the muscles, and it also helps in determining which approach is the best. Now, initially, orbital decompression, unfortunately, was being done by neurosurgeons, where they would go from the head. So they would lift this flap up and raise the whole cranium and do a decompression. Some of the neurosurgeons still do it, which is very sad. But nowadays, orbital decompression can be carried out by oculoplastic or orbital surgeons by a minimal invasive approach, where the patients usually can be discharged the same day and rehabilitation takes place in a week's time. You can either decompress the medial, lateral, inferior wall and some amount of fat. Usually these decompression surgeries are carried out via eyelid incisions, which we are talking about. And this is how the orbit looks after decompression. This is the pre-op orbital imaging before a decompression surgery. You can see that the orbital cavity is smaller as compared to the post-op decompression effect, where the orbit expands. Usually in orbital decompression, first decompression which is done is fat, followed by the lateral wall, medial wall, and the floor. Surgeons keep changing their approaches, but on an average, each wall gives around 2 millimeters of decompression. So a maximum around 6 to 8 millimeters of proptosis reduction can be achieved in cases of orbital decompression. Medial wall is used for severe cases where there is optic neuropathy. These are the various incisions used: the eyelid crease incision for the lateral wall, transcaruncular for the medial wall, transconjunctival for the inferior wall. Let me show you a very small clip of an orbital decompression which is carried out by an eyelid crease incision approach. You can see that through an eyelid crease incision, I am drilling the lateral orbital rim to create space. This is a high-speed burring machine. After the space is created, with this drill, you go behind, protect the globe with an eye shield, and drill within the sphenoid bone deep into the orbit. After all that is done and enough space is created, you expose the orbital fat by exposing the periosteum, and then small amounts of fat can be removed either manually or with the help of a suction to complete the surgery. This is a video of a lateral orbital decompression. Similarly, the medial wall can be approached via the transcaruncular approach. So if you look at it, a transcaruncular approach usually targets the medial wall. This is the incision which is made. You go through the caruncle, so there is no... After the incision is made, it can be just done with a scissors. You expose the medial wall of the orbit with the help of a scissors. You go behind the lacrimal sac. And once the medial wall is exposed, the periosteum is reflected with the help of bud, and the periosteum is opened up. Now, when the periosteum is opened up, what you will see is the thin lamina papracia. Now, this is the periosteum being opened with the help of a monopolar cautery, and then the reflection is done with the help of a periosteum elevator. Now, this is the lamina papracia. You have to be very gentle. The anterior ethmoidal artery is right here, so that has to be cauterized, and then with the help of a punch or with the help of any forceps, you can remove that bone and exteriorize the orbit into the sinuses. Now, this is not a very difficult surgery. It can be finished within an hour. You just have to be careful. Similarly, orbital decompression nowadays we do via the endoscopic approach as well. So endoscopically, you go into the nose, remove the uncinate process and expose the ethmoid sinuses. You can see that the lamina papracia, the ethmoidal air cell, and the roof of the maxillary sinus is right here. And then you see this is the lamina papracia which is being exposed. Drilling is done, and this is the orbital periorbita which is seen. Once this periorbita is excised, you are going to see the medial rectus muscle and the fat is going to come out. These are some results of orbital decompression which can be achieved. These are all patients of mine which I have operated at multiple hospitals, and this was operated at Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital. You can see that the eyelid retraction and the proptosis both have been corrected. Similarly, in this case, this lady came to me from Qatar. She basically came for cosmetic concerns. She had no optic neuropathy, and orbital
Adit, can
decompression
you
was
sum
done
up, please?
via the eyelid crease incision, and you can see this is a 2-week result. I also have a 3-month result, which I have not shown here. Sometimes orbital decompression is necessary in cases like this, where you have to do a decompression to rehabilitate the patient as well. Muscle surgery, usually most commonly inferior rectus recession is performed. I won't go into the details of muscle surgery, but IR recession along with other surgeries can be performed.
Dr. Adit,
Eyelid retraction can be corrected either via the anterior approach or the posterior approach. This is more commonly a cosmetic procedure where we can make an eyelid crease incision and go and relax the levator muscle, and this is the result that you can expect after an eyelid retraction surgery. So to conclude, management of thyroid eye disease is basically a multi-disciplinary approach. It needs cooperation from the orbital surgeon, endocrinologist, a counselor, and also the patient has to be very strong-willed to get over the crisis of this disease. I thank POS team again to give me this opportunity, and I'll be happy to take any questions regarding this topic. Thank you.
It was an excellent talk, Dr. Adit. Very elaborative, very nicely done. Dr. Rujuta, you can carry on. Now.
Thank you, Dr. Adit. So basically, thyroid eye disease is a kind of disease where the pathogenesis, precise pathogenesis is elusive. And what we target the treatment is whatever signs and symptoms we see. And intervention doesn't target at the cause actually. So it's a very complicated disease. And basically what I feel at the same time, you know, that we are MBBS students first, and then the specialists, and then the super specialists. So what my take is that whenever we see any young lady or a young patient with weight loss over a short span of life, or we can just ask her for her weight loss, or just see her pulse, the same jungle. You can just ask her the history of facial hair growth, irregular menses and all. So sometimes we can be the first ones to diagnose the thyroid disease. That's what I feel. Very excellent presentation, Dr. Adit Gupta. Now we'll take the questions. The first question is for Dr. Raghuraj.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. The question is from Dr. Neha. She's asking that in fibrous dysplasia, how is the intensity of recurrence? And in subperiosteal hematoma, the blood be clotted. So you end up aspirating the serum and the clot is left for absorption. So she wants the explanation for that. And could you please explain about DWI in MRI?
Okay. So the first question is about fibrous dysplasia. It is a very slow growing bony tumor. It is usually it is very slow growing that you don't often have to remove everything, because once we have to remove everything, we have to also reconstruct the part of what we've removed. So we don't have to remove all of it. Usually what we do is we wait and we reduce the size of debulk the tumor, the bony tumor, and then wait and watch. There are some instances when after surgery it can become more aggressive, but it is very rare, and it has been reported, but it is very rare that it becomes more aggressive. Usually what is seen is that since it's slow growing, the growth again slowly keeps growing even after surgery. So usually we don't need to do any radical surgery for this kind of tumor, even though it can look very odd and see, it doesn't have that much of recurrence. Regard to subperiosteal hematoma, usually yes, it will clot, but what happens is usually after a couple of days the clot starts breaking up. So what is essentially seen is usually it is in liquid form. So you not only remove the serum part of the blood, you also remove the clot also. So if you can see the video that I had shown, so even the blood also came along with the clot also came along with the when I aspirated. And also it's important to use a very wide bored needle while aspirating the subperiosteal hematoma, so that if there is any thick clot, it will come within the wide bore. So I usually use a 18 gauge needle, so that we can get if there is any thick clot, it will also come within the aspiration. DWI imaging, usually DWI is diffusion weighted imaging. Usually the radiologist, when they are doing when they're doing a MRI, usually they also do a diffusion weighted imaging along with the MRI. In cases of maybe a rhabdomyosarcoma, diffusion weighted imaging can become almost pathognomic. So you can actually, just by sending it for a sending it for a MRI imaging, the radiologist will be able to see using some ADC values to see whether it is correlating with it to diagnose as a rhabdomyosarcoma or not. And any other questions?
Yes, sir. Should I ask one question? Yeah.
Just
How to differentiate pseudotumor from thyroid eye disease MRI?
huh. So the pseudotumor is a
Hello?
kind of a misnomer. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes.
Yes, we
Yeah.
can hear.
Yeah. So the question is how to differentiate between a pseudotumor and a thyroid disease on CT or MRI.
Yes.
So pseudotumor is now not used as much. It's now the thing is orbital inflammatory disease. So how to differentiate mainly is by whether the tendon is spared or not. So thyroid eye disease is very thyroid eye disease. You can make out whether the if the hello yeah. So thyroid eye disease, the tendon is spared in thyroid eye disease. So when Adit also explained that the Coca-Cola sign, Coca-Cola bottle sign, yeah. So there the tendon is spared, the muscle belly is enlarged. Usually, thyroid eye disease also involves the other muscles as well. And most of the time it's bilateral. So one orbit might be more involved than the other. But usually thyroid eye disease is almost, I mean, very rarely is it a unilateral disease. It will be a bilateral. And orbital inflammatory disease most often involves only one muscle, and it's either muscle myositis is there, and always the tendon will be involved. So that is what is how you can differentiate in the CT and the MRI. And also in a uh, orbital inflammatory disease, other adjacent structures also will be involved. So you can make out that it's quite localized. Usually if with a thyroid disease, if it inflammatory is high, it usually involves almost the whole orbit. And any other questions regarding my
Sir,
presentation?
one more question is we are having PGs here. Like a Coca-Cola just named a few signs which PG in their exams of for the Viva on CT and on MRI. Any signs like Coca-Cola bottles and something like that in ophthalmology?
So even in orbital inflammatory disease, something called in posterior posterior uveitis or scleritis, there is something called a T sign. So you can see a T shaped this thing around the optic nerve and the globe. It's called a T sign. So that shows that there is inflammation at the posterior part of the globe, which is continuing along the optic nerve sheath. So that is one of the signs that is there. And other signs, Adit, you want to chip in?
There is one. It's not exactly a named sign, but it is called as the belly sign, which is spoken about in subperiosteal hemorrhage, where there is a convex city in the superior subperiosteal space. Other than that, usually on CT MRI in the orbit, named signs are less from postgraduate point of view. One thing which I would like to add, especially in hello, we can't hear Dr. Rujita.
Please carry on, Dr. Ajit.
Hello.
Okay, I can carry on.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Carry on.
So one thing which I would like to add, in a case of pseudotumor, as Raghu mentioned, lacrimal gland plays a very important role. So inflammation and enlargement of the lacrimal gland will be seen in a lot of cases. And one more thing which is seen in the extraocular muscles is shaggy insertion. So there is a ragged margin to the muscles. It's not smooth as seen in thyroid eye disease. I see 2 or 3 questions which have been asked to me. One is, should we ask only for anti-TSH receptor antibody, or should we ask for other antibodies as well? Usually these antibodies have more of academic significance. The only antibody which works well from a clinical point of view, which has been mentioned in endocrinology literature as well, is the TRAB antibody, or anti-TSH receptor antibody as we call it. It helps in prognosticating the disease. So if you have performed a TRAB antibody right at the start of the disease and you continue doing it throughout the course of the disease, you will see a decrease in titers. That is what literature mentions. I personally don't do it. I do it only in euthyroid eye disease cases where I want to prove that there could be antibodies leading to, because you have to prove it to the patient, right? Sometimes the patient doesn't understand what you're talking about. I do it only in cases of euthyroid eye disease. One more question which has been asked by Dr. Kabra is, what are the common complications of decompression surgery? Now, decompression surgery historically had a lot of complications because it was being performed by neurosurgeons. After orbital surgeons have taken over, the complication rates have gone down. Still, one of the most common complications which we encounter after a decompression surgery is surgical diplopia. So if the range of surgical diplopia after decompression surgery ranges from 2 to 8%, depending on what technique you're using. With newer techniques, it's much low and it can be taken care of. The diplopia also resolves after 2 to 6 weeks of conservative treatment. If it does not, you might have to perform additional strabismus surgeries. Second commonly encountered complication of a decompression is CSF leaks, which can happen intra-op because of exposure of the dura, which again usually spontaneously resolve on their own. They don't even require antibiotics. Third common complication is supraorbital nerve anesthesia, because we are exposing the rim. Supraorbital nerve can sometimes get involved. Along with that, infraorbital nerves also can get involved. Historically, they also say that vision loss can happen in 1 out of 10 lakh cases. It is equivalent to endophthalmitis happening in a cataract surgery, but vision loss is very rare after decompression using the modern decompression techniques. Tips for injecting an orbital steroid injection is one more question which has been asked to me. What I do is I use a tuberculin syringe, which is a 1 cc syringe with a 26 gauge needle. I use Oracort or Kenacort, whatever is available, in the concentration of 40 milligrams per ml. The injection has to be very slow. It should be given in the inferolateral quadrant because it's the least avascular quadrant. You go around 5 millimeters inside the rim, keep the needle facing towards the bone and give it in the peribulbar space. Don't go intraconal. It should be given in the extraconal compartment. And it has to be very slowly injected. If you use a 2 cc or a 5 cc syringe, you cannot control the pace of injection, and also the dose titration becomes difficult. You can rotate the site of injection if repeated injections have to be given. And you have to monitor the IOP 2 weeks after giving the injection, because sometimes transient IOP increase can happen, and then you have to stop giving these injections.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Hello. Yes, there is a question, Dr. Raghunash. Can you just name the conditions where only CT suffices? Conditions where only MRI is enough, and the conditions where CT as MRI mandatory.
Uh, so there is no hard and fast. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Yeah. So there are
Yes.
no hard and fast rules. Usually, any kind of fractures, you don't need an MRI. So most of the time, you don't need an MRI, and usually a CT scan without contrast is enough for any of the fractures that we see. And whenever you're suspecting any bony pathology, hello.
Yes, you are audible, please.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So whenever you're suspecting any bony pathology, a CT scan always helps. And what I usually do in my practice is usually I order if I'm suspecting an orbital mass, I usually order a MRI orbits, and I request the radiologist to give me a CT scan screening. So what they do is they do the CT scan complementary if you do the MRI orbits. So it is depends on your understanding with your radiologist. So if you have somebody whom you can refer to on a regular basis, they usually, if you tell them on the to do CT scan complementary, they usually do a screening as well. So if there is an orbital lesion and if there is any bony erosion, so the MRI will give a good soft tissue resolution of the mass. And if there is a CT, if there is a bony erosion, the CT scan will pick up the erosion as well. So that way you get more information about the tumor as such. But in thyroid eye disease, again, if you're planning for a surgery, it's better to get a CT scan done rather than an MRI. But if you want to see more delineation of the muscles, whether it is a fat, how much of the fat is there, fat volume or the muscle volume, and even the activity also, it's better seen in an MRI than in a CT scan. But again, it's no hard and fast rules that CT is always better. It's how you interpret the images that is more important than actual a CT scan or an MRI. And one another thing where MRI is very useful is in vascular lesions like AV malformations and AV malformations, as well as venous lymphatic malformations. In in those cases, MRI gives better picture, and also it's diagnostic in many cases when you also combine it with the with the contrast enhancement using a dynamic, what is called a dynamic MRI. So there they will move the dynamic MRI. Patient
Yes.
is sitting and then goes in, and then you will be able to appreciate whether it is a venous lymphatic or a vascular lesion.
Right. So especially for our PG students, is there any mnemonic or a way to remember the colors of different structures, like get confused between white and gray colors in CT, MRI, T1, T2, and also, is there any easy way to remember this?
I mean, usually you don't need to know all of it. Basically,
Just the basics.
what is useful is see the color of the vitreous color. So if it is hypo intense, that is, if it is dark, that means it's a T1 weighted image. And if it is white, it is lit up. If the vitreous is lit up, it is a T2 weighted image. So and if you look at the muscles, and if you see it is lit up, and that is basically means that there is a contrast enhancement in the CT scan that you are seeing. And T1 weighted images will give you anatomical details, and T2 will give pathological details. So these are the things that you need to, this is basically basic rules. You don't need to know what each structure is unless you're actually looking into the specific things, and that time you can always look back and see what thing. But on a regular basis, when you're seeing in the clinic or in the viva voce, when you're having a viva, usually this much of information is enough for you to interpret the images.
There is one mnemonic which I used to follow when I was a PG student or in MBBS. It was a very silly one, but it is called as World War II, WW2. It's a very silly one, but it says that vitreous is white in 2. So vitreous V is converted to W, white is W and 2. So T2 images, the vitreous is going to be white, CSF is going to be white. So that is how I used to usually remember that if the vitreous appears white, I used to call it T2 imaging. So that is something which might help the PP student.
Yeah, good one. Liked it. There's one question. Any role of injection hyaluronidase in acute conditions where immediate decompression is not possible? Dr. Adi.
That is an interesting question. There is no literature to report the role of hyaluronidase in thyroid eye disease where there is optic nerve compression, but it has been tried in patients who have had optic nerve compromise because of filler induced blindness. So when cosmetic filler injections are done and there is a compromise or vascular compromise, hyaluronidase has been injected in the orbit to try and relieve the compression. But at least in thyroid eye disease, I've never heard of anyone using hyaluronidase in the orbit in such cases.
Okay. Any role of selenium supplements and radioactive iodine in thyroid ophthalmopathy?
Radioactive iodine actually, in some amount of cases, aggravates the thyroid eye disease. So when a patient with Graves' disease is undergoing radioactive iodine treatment, you have to stress upon the fact to the radiation oncologist and the endocrinologist to start a course of steroids pre-op and a week post-op to tide over any inflammation that might occur in that phase. So whenever a patient is being sent for radioactive iodine, you can expect a flare-up of the disease in some amount of cases. Selenium has some role in, it is a questionable role, but it doesn't harm in giving a selenium supplement. 200 micrograms should be given approximately for 3 to 6 weeks, but still no one knows whether it actually helps or not. It is just a micronutrient which might have some financial interest. So you can try giving it in the active phase or when you diagnose a patient to delay the progression of the disease.
The radioactive iodine, is it used because of this hazard or it is not at all used, or there are specific indications for it?
No, so radioactive iodine use is basically usually not decided by the ophthalmologist or by us. The decision is taken by the endocrinologist in conjunction with a patient. So when a Graves' disease patient presents, it can be because of toxic multinodular goiter. So when this happens, there are three ways ahead. One is using neomercazole to suppress the hormones. Second is using radioactive iodine to ablate the thyroid gland tissue so that you convert a hyperthyroid patient into a hypothyroid and then keep him on replacement therapy throughout his life. And third is the role of surgery where they do a partial thyroidectomy or a subcomplete thyroidectomy to reduce the amount of thyroid hormone secretion. So radioactive iodine use or not is decided by the endocrinologist and after counseling the patient. We just have to take care that when they are using radioactive iodine, the eye disease should not flare up, and so we give steroids in the meanwhile.
So regarding IV steroids,
Sorry, I can't hear.
They're giving 1 to 4
I think we have
Hello?
somewhere.
Can you
Sorry,
Hello?
I couldn't hear the last comment.
Can you hear me now? Regarding, can you? Hello.
Yes, now we can hear you, but we could not hear the last comment.
Yes. Regarding the IV steroids, there are different regimes, as you said.
Correct.
Like you are following all. So which regime is to follow this, follow the other regime?
So regarding the IV steroid regimes, it depends a lot on the comfort of the physician, of the ophthalmologist, physician, and the patient. Now, if a patient is coming from far away places where there is no access to proper physician monitoring and all, you can even admit the patient and give them a regime over a period of 3 days where you inject 500 milligrams spread over a period of 8 hours, twice a day, and then inject it over a period of 3 days, send the patient back home, and call them after 3 to 4 weeks for a second course. The regime that I follow, because nowadays, even in far-fetched rural India and rural Maharashtra, you can easily find a physician who can administer IV methylprednisolone, monitoring the blood pressure and the ECG. I usually give pulse doses, so it is very convenient for the patient as well. The regimen is spread out over certain weeks, and the patient also gets time to see the response. I give 500 milligrams every week, once a week for 6 doses, followed by 250 milligrams every week for 6 weeks for 6 doses. So total of 12 doses, cumulative dose of 6 grams is given. Also gives me 2 grams of cover, which I can use over a period of time if there is resistance to the initial therapy. So I have around 2 grams left with me to use if at all I have to plan a surgery, or pre-op or post-op dosage can be given. So these are the 2 regimens. There are other regimens also where people give 1 gram over a single dose bolus dose over a period of 3 days, and then send the patient back and repeat these cycles over 3 weekly or 4 weekly intervals. So regimens have to be decided by the physician, ophthalmologist, and the patient's comfort looking at. Most of the regimens have shown almost similar results as long as the dosage is correct and it is given in the right form.
Okay. Dr. Adit, can you say a few things about pediatric thyroid eye disease?
Yeah, so that is also a very important, as thyroid abnormalities in general are increasing overall because of hypothyroidism is very common nowadays. We are seeing a rise in pediatric thyroid eye disease cases as well. So in pediatric cases, eyelid retraction also can be because of other conditions like midbrain lesions, pontine lesions. So that is one thing important to differentiate in cases of pediatric thyroid eye disease patients. The treatment doesn't vary, it's the same. Usually pediatric cases are not very severe. I have not seen, I don't have a very long spanning career, but till now I have not seen an active case in a pediatric patient. I don't know what is Dr. Raghuraj's experience. Dr. Ganga has one series where he's spoken about pediatric inflammatory diseases and pediatric thyroid eye disease. But it is, it's very uncommon in the Indian subpopulation, because as it is, thyroid eye disease is not very common in India. It's more common in Europe and the Caucasian population.
I have seen a couple of cases, but in pediatric thyroid eye disease, it's not as severe as what is seen in adults. Usually, it is much more of a subtle signs that you can see. Usually, what happens is they come after the active phase of the disease is over, and they usually come with the eyelid retraction. That is most common. The 2 cases that I have seen are usually after the retraction has occurred and the active phase of the thyroid disease is passed.
So in
But
thyroid yeah, please.
The one I saw was, I think, 8 years old, and the other patient was 10 years old.
Okay. So in thyroid ophthalmic disease, so many things to remember for the PG, so many classifications like modified nose specs, modified CAS, Yugo, Visa, so many signs to remember, and I'm sure that the PGs will do well in all these. Any questions from the audience, Dr. Gitanjali, Dr. Mukesh?
I don't see any more questions, and I think Dr. Adit and Dr. Raghu has explained it very well, and thank you very much. I also thank all the PG teachers who have joined today. Dr. OK sir, I can see Dr. Shashi Prasad madam, Dr. Sanjay Shah, Dr. Aarti Parsula madam. So there are many other PG teachers along with their students, they have joined, and they all must be benefited. And I think it would help you during your exam as well as in your practice later. So thank you, Dr. Adit and Dr. Raghu. And thank you, Dr. Rujuta, for moderating very well. I now pass on to Dr. Mukesh for further announcements.
It was really wonderful to have you, Dr. Adit and Dr. Raghu, with us today. It was a wonderful session. And we really look forward to many more associations with you. I have some announcements to make. We want more and more people to be, we know it's a lockdown going on, but it would be good that many of you can join the POS as a members, and it's pretty easy. You can just log on to the POS website and it will really help us, and tell the PGs and fellows, the new people who are coming to Pune, to be a part of the POS faculty. I would also like to announce our next workshop on uveitis and rheumatology, which we are planning on 28th of June. The time is yet to be decided, but we will keep you in loop. We are going to put it on WhatsApp as well as on an email and Facebook. We also invite everyone to share their videos. For example, we had some lovely videos today from Dr. Adit and Dr. Raguraj. If they can share with us, we want these videos to be available on a POS platform, on a YouTube channel for people, for PGs and fellows to view. And we want to make it a huge platform, not only for Pune or Maharashtra. We want to go to a pan-India and perhaps at an international platform, so that more and more people can come. So these lovely videos, if we are made available freely on our platform for the postgraduates and fellows, and even for ophthalmologists like me, it would be really good. So we are calling in for videos not only from cataract, but beyond, from all subspecialties, from pediatrics, the oculoplasty. So if you have some wonderful videos, please share to us. We will be very happy to share it on our platform. So with this, I think I'd like to conclude, and we have Dr. Sachin with us, Dr. Sachin Kabra, sir. So would you like to say something?
Yeah, hi everybody. Excellent webinar. Personally, thank Dr. Hegde and Dr. Adit. Dr. Hegde's presentation was very good, to the point, simple. And Adit, you are a bright star. Fantastic. Loved your talk. And thank you everybody for joining on Sunday morning. Special thank to our President, Dr. Gitanjali Sharma ma'am, our Secretary Mukesh, Coordinator Dr. Rutuja, and all team of Management Committee of POS for working hard to make this happen. Thank you one and all, and look forward to further more presentation. Thank you.
And I would like to have feedback from all the PGs regarding these PG activities that POS is doing. Please give your feedbacks to Dr. Mukesh, to Dr. Rujuta, or to Dr. Sachin Kabra. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.